Go ahead and raise your hand if you've heard this before. The tight end position this past week absolutely sucked for fantasy football. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? The tight end position for week 1 was absolutely terrible. And if you're looking at the tight end spot on your team and you're underwhelmed with how they performed, you're not the only one out there. In fact, why don't I give you a little bit of information real quick so you can comprehend just how bad things were in week 1. Remember Isaiah Likely's big Thursday night game? He scored 21.6 fantasy points. He was the tight end 1 this week. But there were only 2 other tight ends that scored double-digit half PPR fantasy points. Foster Moreau from New Orleans was the tight end 2 on the week. Then Kyle Pitts, who scored 10.1 fantasy points, was the tight end 3. The tight end 12 on the week was Noah Gray. He scored 5.2 fantasy points. And Chigioco, he scored 8.5 fantasy points as the tight end 6. 6 of those 8.5 fantasy points came from just the touchdown alone, plus another half a point for the catch. Basically, his entire day was made in one play, and he was the tight end 6. That's why when I tell you in the offseason that tight ends could trip into the end zone and be a tight end 1 on the week, this is the outcome I'm talking about. But today's tight end start and sit analysis is going to be very similar to what we did already for week 1 and for all the other positions. We're going to talk about how risky each of these players are. And for a majority of the tight ends, they're going to be very risky. But then we'll talk a little bit about the matchup that they have this week. Now, again, basically all tight ends were awful last week. So the matchups this week, they don't matter as much because I don't know if we have an accurate picture on how good some of these defenses are against opposing tight ends. So today, I'm going to spend more time talking about the tight ends and how they fit into their own scheme and their own team, and then we'll find some decent matchups to go along with it. But the first matchup we're going to talk about comes on Thursday Night Football. It's going to be the Buffalo Bills heading to Miami. Dalton Kincaid owners do not love what they saw in Buffalo this past week. He's supposed to be the big breakout candidate this year, and instead, him and Dawson Knox each had 2 targets. They combined for 2 catches and 34 yards this past week. Dawson Knox is touchdown dependent. We've said that all offseason. Josh Allen loves to look his way when they get into the red zone, unless he's running the ball himself. Maybe we'll see some touchdowns from Dawson Knox. He's super risky because of that. But Dalton Kincaid, this is not a great first impression on the season. Do I think things will get better? Yeah, absolutely. They're not going to be this bad. But it is interesting that Josh Allen spent a ton of time targeting his unknown wide receivers this past week and not going after Dalton Kincaid, who he's already spent an entire season with. And because I am a little bit concerned with what Dalton Kincaid is going to do, I still wanted to put in an underdog ticket and include one of his pick'ems in it. And there is an awesome new feature where you can actually slide what you want their line to be, and it will adjust what the payout is. So I decided to put in a ticket with Dalton Kincaid, and I decided to go higher after sliding it down to 39.5 receiving yards. The actual line is a little bit higher than that right now, but to play it safe because of what we saw in week 1, I do think things will get better, but this gives me a little bit of breathing room and it gives me a better chance to hit on my ticket with Dalton Kincaid there. 4, count them, 4 tight ends saw snaps for the Miami Dolphins. A team that's not even known for utilizing their tight end decided to give snaps to 4 different ones, even though you've got big play Jonnu Smith hanging out on your sideline. And what's super interesting, Julian Hill saw 42 snaps this week. Jonnu Smith only saw 20. I was hoping that Jonnu Smith would be a sleeper tight end for us this season. But based on what I've seen over the first week and the preseason, I don't know if Jonnu Smith is going to do anything for Miami this year. Keep an eye on it. Let's see what happens with him. But right now, I'm staying away from all the tight ends in Miami. Taysom Hill is a lot like Taco Bell. Y'all keep going back there, even though you know what the outcome is going to be 90% of the time. And it happened once again. Taysom Hill let everybody down in week 1 that wanted to start him. Taysom Hill has to be the most volatile tight end in all of football. That's saying a lot when the position itself is the worst position in football to try and figure out. We have to stop starting Taysom Hill. We really do. If you want to keep risking it every single week, that's fine. If you want to get him in best ball, I'm okay with that as well. Best ball doesn't bother me at all, but trying to figure out when he's going to get you 0.2 points or 1.4 points or go off for 28 points is unrealistic. And Foster Moreau apparently is the main tight end there in New Orleans now. Moreau played 50 snaps this past week compared to 23 for Juwan Johnson and only 21 from Taysom Hill. By the way, Taysom Hill is supposed to have all this touchdown upside. 2 tight ends scored touchdowns this week. Neither one of them were Taysom Hill. If you want to try and find a tight end in the New Orleans offense that you can utilize for an okay ceiling and a pretty low floor, it's going to be Foster Moreau. I'm not expecting this type of output every single week, but if he can become a consistent number 3 in this offense, he may put together a pretty decent fantasy season. For the Dallas Cowboys, it definitely sounds like Jake Ferguson is going to miss some time, but as of this recording, we're not 100% sure how much time that may end up being. Luke Schoonmaker is probably the next tight end up, but I'm not going to roll with it. Brandon Cooks obviously solidified himself as the number 2 option in this offense until Jake Ferguson comes back. So for me, Schoonmaker or whoever they decide to go with is not going to be on my radar for week 2. Cade Otton is exactly who we thought he was. A lot of people were hoping that maybe this would be the season that he put together a tight end 1 type of year, but that's not happening. Over 50 snaps played, over 20 routes ran, and only 2 targets. He plays a lot of snaps, he runs a lot of routes, he doesn't get a lot of targets, he's not fantasy viable. He'll throw you a few touchdowns every now and then, but other than that, it's not worth risking it. It was the Jameson Williams show in week 1, and because of that, a lot of owners for Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta were not super happy. Now, Sam Laporta still saw 5 targets. Not bad. The volume's going to end up coming back. He'll be okay. Yeah, maybe there may be a little bit more inconsistencies than what we saw last year from Sam Laporta, but one thing that's going to help is that Jameson Williams, being as dynamic as he was in week 1, is going to draw a lot of attention down the field. And when that happens, that's going to leave the middle of the field wide open, and it could mean bigger plays for Sam Laporta, even if there's a little bit less volume than what we would like. That feeling that I had down to my plums last week about Kylen Granson, yeah, that didn't work out. The Indianapolis Colts last week decided, hey, we're going to start running 3 wide. And because of that, we didn't see the tight end on the field as what we were kind of accustomed to last season. It makes sense. They've got some pretty good dynamic playmakers now, and it's only going to happen more often when Josh Downs comes back. So really, because it's a 3-way rotation at the tight end position for Indianapolis, and because of what we saw from the rotation at wide receivers and wanting to go 3 wide more often, the tight end position may be all but done in Indianapolis. It really felt like this offseason when I saw people talking about Green Bay tight ends, it was all about Luke Musgrave. And I tried to remind people several times that down the stretch last season, Tucker Kraft, when Luke Musgrave was not there, and even when he came back, was a much more serviceable tight end. And that could end up carrying over to this season based on how Jordan Love interacted with him at the end of last year. Kraft played 64 snaps this past week, compared to only 17 for Luke Musgrave. He ran 30 routes compared to Luke Musgrave's 8 routes ran. Now, both of them ended with 2 targets each. That's not great. Clearly, on a per route basis, Luke Musgrave was much better with the targets. But the tight end that's on the field 3/4 of the time is going to be Tucker Kraft. And if that continues to happen, nothing's going to matter about Luke Musgrave. It's not going to matter if they get the same amount of targets or not. Neither of these tight ends may end up being serviceable, but if one of them have a shot, it's going to be the guy that's on the field way more often. There's not much that I'm excited for when it comes to the tight end matchup for the Jets and the Titans this week. Tyler Conklin had a great opportunity this past week to be a quick target for Aaron Rodgers to get the ball out fast, and he only saw 2 targets. There's 3 guys right now ahead of the pecking order when it comes to Tyler Conklin and targets this season. Chigiooko, he's not going to see a whole lot of volume. You saw that this past week. He's going to score a touchdown every once in a while, but as soon as DeAndre Hopkins starts to get more and more healthy, hopefully anyway, he works his way into more and more routes, more and more snaps, and then he ends up being one of those red zone threats that takes away the potential for Chigiooko to score each week. Not a great first game for George Kittle, and with no Brandon Ayuk, I was hoping for a little bit more volume than what we saw. However, maybe Brandon Ayuk being back would end up being better for George Kittle. Because once again, it's not about the volume with George Kittle. It's about what he does with the volume he gets. And if we're stretching the field with Brandon Ayuk, that's more room over the middle for George Kittle to break explosive plays. He had one of those this past week, but he didn't have nearly as many that we've become accustomed to. So while the volume probably ends up staying the same, we need Brandon Ayuk back in the lineup way more often to open up the middle of the field so George Kittle can roam and have some fun. For last week's video, Josh Oliver was listed here because he was the #1 tight end on the depth chart. This week, Josh Oliver is still #1 on the depth chart. I'm not adding Johnny Mundt right now. For you Minnesota fans that were like, watch this, he's coming, great week, it didn't end up happening, okay? Maybe it does happen this week, especially with Jordan Addison banged up. But Josh Oliver and Johnny Mundt, they ran the same amount of routes and had the same amount of snaps. If Mundt really is going to be this big pass catcher that Minnesota fans thinks he's going to be, then this would be the week for him to show it. And maybe it happens. But for me, do we really find ourselves in such an awful position that Johnny Mundt's the guy that we're going to start in week 2? Not really a whole lot I'm tracking for the Seattle and New England matchup this week. Noah Fant had 4 targets last week. It ended up being tied for second on the team, but the wide receivers that are in front of him right now, even if they see the same amount of targets, it doesn't matter. Their big playability is better. That matchup last week would have been a great opportunity for Noah Fant to establish some fantasy relevance for the rest of the season, and it didn't happen. And for New England, Hunter Henry saw more snaps. He ran more routes, but Austin Hooper had 1 more target, and he did more with it. Not a great fantasy situation right now, and I'm still super confused on why they paid Hunter Henry twice now, and they're still not using him to the best of his abilities. Theo Johnson, the rookie tight end for the New York Giants, played 61 snaps this past week. He's definitely one of the more intriguing options to keep an eye on right now. Across from him, Ben Sinnott was another rookie tight end that a lot of people felt like had a great breakout opportunity. The problem is there's not really anybody that's relevant sitting in front of Theo Johnson, and Zach Ertz is sitting in front of Ben Sinnott. And while we'll continue to monitor Theo Johnson, and I think he's got about a mid-level risk this week because I think with Daniel Jones, they're going to go back to the ground level, do some quick passes, get him some confidence, and Theo Johnson could be that guy to help out. I'm not risking a whole lot of my fantasy season on somebody attached to Daniel Jones. And Zach Ertz saw 4 targets this past week, and he was the #3 receiver on the team behind their 2 running backs. The writing was on the wall. Short, quick passes with Jaden Daniels. Let him use his legs and let him build his confidence. As the season wears on, as long as Zach Ertz stays healthy, we could see some more targets start to pile up for him. He's kind of a medium risk right now, though. You're either going to get maybe a couple of fantasy points, or maybe we can find Zach Ertz with 6 targets in a week and get him more in that low tight end 1 status. And if he scores a touchdown based on last week, he's a tight end 1. It appears Hayden Hurst could end up having a pretty decent role in this Chargers offense. And we talked about it this preseason that Jim Harbaugh loves his tight ends. But we didn't really know where Hayden Hurst fell in the pecking order. There's a lot of questions at the wide receiver position, and there's really not anybody that is the alpha right now. So Hayden Hurst might find himself with some targets here or there over the coming weeks. And if he does, some of those targets could end up making him fantasy relevant. And I'm super intrigued in this matchup because Carolina gave up touchdowns twice to tight ends last week. And if we can get in the red zone with the Chargers, Hayden Hurst has some touchdown potential as well. The rookie Ja'Tavion Sanders ended up being the tight end one for Carolina this past week. He played over 40 snaps at the tight end position, but he only saw one target. And Carolina's offense right now is kind of a mess. Really, the whole team is. If they're as bad as what we saw last year and as bad as what we saw in week 1, yeah, they're going to play in a lot of negative game script, but I don't know if I can trust Bryce Young to consistently get the ball to any of his wide receivers, let alone his rookie tight end. David Njoku got off to a quick start last week, but unfortunately, an injury is probably going to sideline him for the next few weeks. So Jordan Akins is probably going to be the guy to step up in his place and be the starting tight end moving forward. Now, he was the number 2 receiving option this past week for Deshaun Watson. But I'm still not loving that offense with Deshaun Watson. There's nothing about it that intrigues me. Amari Cooper, unfortunately, is super unstable. Njoku's going to be unstable when he comes back. The run game is unstable right now. I don't really know what to think about where Cleveland believes this offense is going. But for me, it's not heading in a good enough direction that Jordan Akins is fantasy viable and in my lineup. Evan Ingram, awful week 1, which is super unfortunate given how safe he was last season. But maybe it's the fact that teams just paid more attention to him and that Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis didn't see nearly as much of attention. The better those two are in the offense and the more defenses start to respect them, that's going to open Evan Ingram back up because it's going to be really tough to guard Gabe Davis and his speed on the outside, Brian Thomas and his speed on the outside, and then also keep an eye on Evan Ingram over the middle. Throw in Christian Kirk as well to just keep defenses occupied. Ingram will end up getting better, but I think it's going to take a couple of weeks for defenses to start thinking to themselves, hey, let's pay a little bit more attention to the outside rather than the middle of the field. Now we've come to the portion of the tight end video that the most people are probably going to be interested in, and it's going to be the debate between Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews. And I want you to all hold on with me real quick because I'm not so quick to jump on the fact that Isaiah Likely is going to be this massive fantasy asset in 2024. Now, I want to start this section by giving a quick shout out to Andy Holloway from the Fantasy Footballers because he had a really, really good thread on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, essentially breaking down why, yeah, he wasn't in love with Mark Andrews just like we weren't this offseason. He was a must avoid in our draft guide. But he still saw better weeks ahead for him. And you can see from the numbers and from the video, Kansas City, when they play Baltimore, wants to lock down Mark Andrews. And they have done that the last several times that they have played. And the video evidence shows the same thing. Mark Andrews was not allowed to get free. He even saw double teams sometimes. And there was times when he was left on the line to help block a little bit as well. That's not going to be the case moving forward for the rest of the season. And now that Isaiah Likely's had a huge breakout week, I wouldn't be shocked if Mark Andrews finds a little bit extra room to roam as well. Me personally, we probably can still try to start both of these guys. They are going to bring some risk though until we know for sure that either A, Mark Andrews is cooked, he's done, it wasn't Kansas City, he just doesn't have it anymore, Isaiah Likely's the guy. Or B, Isaiah Likely is going to have some up and down weeks. He's going to be really good at times. He's going to be kind of gone at times. And that Mark Andrews is still the number 1 option for Lamar Jackson, even if it didn't show up in week 1. This could go a couple of different ways. And you're going to really have to hold and be careful with how it goes over the next couple of weeks. Because Isaiah Likely could disappear this week. And it could be Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews could come back with a vengeance this week, and it's going to make Isaiah Likely disappear. And who knows, maybe Lamar Jackson feeds both of them moving forward, and we have two top tight end candidates from the same team. I'm not sure how much Colby Parkinson was supposed to be a part of the Rams' game plan against the Lions, but after Puka Nacua went down early, tried to come back, and then left the game for good, he ended up seeing a few different targets and had some plays that worked really well for him. Now, the wide receivers will still end up being the main targets, especially Cooper Kupp, in this offense. I mean, Kupp saw 21 targets this past week. He could see 15 to 20 on any given week. The guys around him will see a few targets as well. But if you're looking for a shot in the dark, if your tight end position is so bad that you really don't have anyone else to rely on, Colby Parkinson and one of the highest volume passing offenses in the league isn't the worst shot you've ever taken. This is super obvious, so you don't have to leave any comments about it. But because of how bad the tight end position was last week, I'm going to make Trey McBride my Manscaped must-have play of the week at the tight end position. And your team may need a ton of help at the tight end position, almost as much help as you need down there. And that's why Manscaped is here to help us all out. So make sure you head on over to manscaped.com, use code word headliners20 to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. But Trey McBride has a really solid matchup here. Sam Laporta, not all that bad last week, and had he seen more targets, he probably would have put up a bigger day. But Jameson Williams saw a lot of that against the Rams. So Trey McBride, 9 targets, leading the team. He may lead the team again this week in targets. You absolutely need to have him in your lineup, and you already do. But let's put him in our underdog ticket as well. And that's why I'm making him my must-have play of the week. Because I'm going on over to underdog right now, where his current line is set at 49.5 receiving yards, and I'm going to click higher. Give me those receiving yards this week and a pretty good matchup for him, and we'll go ahead and walk away with a winner. So I've got good news and I've got some bad news. Let's start with the good news. Pat Freiermuth is clearly the number one receiving tight end on the Pittsburgh Steelers. But here's the bad news. Pat Freiermuth, Mykel Pruitt, and Darnell Washington all played at least 37 snaps this past week. That is a ton of snaps for all 3 tight ends to be on the field. Clearly, they're wanting to run a lot of 3 tight end sets, 2 tight end sets, and maybe out of those sets, we start to see a little bit more action for Pat Freiermuth. But that's a lot of opportunities taken away from him that really shouldn't be. It's going to make Pat Freiermuth volatile this season. The good news is, once again, though, that Justin Fields is the starting quarterback right now. And we know Justin Fields loves his tight end. Cole Kmet was his guy in Chicago. Now, when Russell Wilson comes back, maybe that changes a little bit. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But Pat Freiermuth still has a glimmer of hope. It's not as bad as it was a couple of weeks ago. It's a little bit better, but it's still something we're going to have to eye very carefully. Greg Dulcich ran the 3rd most routes of any Broncos player this past week, but he only saw 2 targets. The Broncos defense to me feels outdated. Sean Payton feels outdated. I don't know how much better this offense will end up being this season. Bo Nix certainly didn't look the part. He could end up getting better, absolutely. But a lot of the same concerns I had in my video breakdowns to begin the year and when he was drafted came true once again this past weekend. Got a lot of concerns. Greg Dulcich, though, isn't fantasy viable, so he's kind of on the bottom of the list of that concern. My must-avoid player at the tight end position last week was Mike Gesicki, and I feel like I nailed that one. This past week, he actually was in a 3-way rotation at the tight end position. He saw 10 less snaps than Drew Sample. Mike Gesicki had 4 targets, but Tanner Hudson had 3 targets. There was also some fumbling issues at the tight end position as well, one of which was Mike Gesicki. I really don't know how this rotation is going to work out over the next couple of weeks, but I don't feel like Mike Gesicki was utilized well with no T. Higgins on the field. So do we really think that he would be utilized better when T. Higgins comes back? Probably not. Mike Gesicki's probably going to be in a void moving forward until we see differently. Listen, I know that you want more upside and you wish Travis Kelce would have given you more last week, and you're probably upset that you spent another pick on Travis Kelce, or you think he's washed up, or whatever negative thoughts you had after only 1 week of football were. But Travis Kelce is going to be just fine, ladies and gentlemen. And the fact that Xavier Worthy had a big first week only helps the fact that Travis Kelce is going to have more opportunities moving forward. That's speed from Worthy on the outside. Even though it's not going to bring consistent 2-touchdown weeks, nobody is at this point, is still going to bring a lot of consistency in terms of teams paying attention to him. And when they do that, Travis Kelce is going to get open, and we will find Travis Kelce. Now, Rashee Rice, I don't think he's going anywhere. His volume will be good, but Travis Kelce will likely be right there with him by the end of the season. Well, all of the preseason trends that we saw with the tight end position in Chicago ended up coming true. Gerald Everett in week 1 played more snaps, ran more routes, and had more targets than Cole Kmet. Gerald Everett is clearly the tight end 1 in Chicago. Now, that may not make him super fantasy viable, and we have thought Gerald Everett was on the verge of breakouts in the past. But this coming week, with Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen both banged up, we could see Gerald Everett have a decent size options within the game plan. Keep an eye on him. He's likely still available on your waiver wire, and if you can snatch him up because you're dealing with injuries or whatever else at the tight end position, or you decided to draft Taysom Hill as your tight end 1, let's go with Gerald Everett this week instead. I wasn't on Dalton Schultz at all this offseason, and week 1 was exactly why. You're going to have targets going to Diggs. You're going to have targets going to Dell. You're going to have targets going to Collins. And of course, they're going to run the football and run it heavily with Joe Mixon. There's just not enough room in this offense for Dalton Schultz. He's going to throw out some touchdowns every once in a while. Maybe if somebody were to go down with an injury, be banged up, or miss some time, he could grab some fantasy viable performances during that span. But he shouldn't be owned right now, and you shouldn't be stashing him. It's week 1, and Kyle Pitts already has a touchdown. We're off to a fabulous start. Now, will he only get 3 more this season? Because that would give him 1 his rookie year, 2 in his second year, 3 in his third year, and 4 in his fourth year. Hopefully not, because that would be another wasted pick this year. But, when it comes to this offense, I really do think that Kyle Pitts is going to end up being one of the main guys for Kirk Cousins. Maybe right now, Kirk Cousins, he's just trying to get himself mentally back into the game. After you have that Achilles tear, it's really tough to move around the pocket and do things that you're so used to doing beforehand that your body hasn't done in a while. Kyle Pitts should be that safety valve for Kirk Cousins. They should be utilizing him in a manner where we can get the ball out quickly, and Cousins doesn't have to stand around and move around all that often. Let's get the ball into the hands of Kyle Pitts. He's going to be a big red zone option for them. Hopefully they can ride Bijan outside of the 20s, and then when they get to the red zone, they'll take a shot at Kyle Pitts. Maybe I didn't need to be as worried about Dallas Goedert as I was this offseason. I really thought that there was a shot that he could end up being behind Saquon Barkley in terms of targets. And in this past game, he was not. Barkley had a huge day, don't get me wrong, but Goddard was the number 3 option, and that could continue to happen. But keep an eye on Jahan Dotson. If Jahan Dotson starts to work his way into the game plan a little bit more often and sees some time in the slot, that could end up hurting Goddard. But if he really doesn't adjust to the game plan all that well, or he just ends up seeing some touches here or there, some targets here or there, Dallas Goedert is going to have an extremely low ceiling. But if you need 4 or 5 points from a tight end, Dallas Goedert could end up being that guy. Yo, Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for my tight end video. Now, if the analysis here wasn't as, we'll say, girthy as what you're used to, I would understand why you would feel like that. But also the reason why is because I don't think we got an accurate portrayal of how these defenses actually are going to be against tight ends right now. There were a lot of bad performances for tight ends last week, and it could take a few more weeks before we can finally start to see a trend with some of these defenses and whether or not they're going to be a really good matchup. So for right now, I'm going to stay focused on how are these tight ends being utilized within their own offense. And if we can follow that route for right now, we'll start finding the matchups more and more as the season goes on. But Headliner Nation, I'm going to go ahead and call it there so I can do wide receivers and quarterbacks. Hopefully everybody has a great rest of the day. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.